What does the typical process of developing a project look like at ecoLogicStudio?
In terms of projects, our work always progress, if we want to answer your question, in multiple scale at the same time, from material experimentation to digital modeling to larger scale mapping. In all the projects, we bring forward this different experimentation at the same time.
What pricked your interest in design, biotechnology, and biodesign?
We have an interest on ecology at large, and in particular, for us, has always been relevant to understand how ecology and ecological systems that are often seen from a technological point of view can be more holistically integrated in the design realm. This comes from multiple events, let's say, an interest that on Marco and myself. Marco has a particular interest on health, well-being, as well as sport activity and exploring the landscape physically, that he has always been connecting with architecture. In my case, instead, I always had an interest on both science and art, and now these two realm of knowledge can contribute to architecture. From this background, I would say, when I just graduated from the Faculty of Engineering in Turin, I started to work in research, and my first task was to set up a lab that will look at how environmental design will impact design. While I was working on this research many years ago, I realized that many of the solutions were actually technological solutions attached to an architecture. There was no integration. At the same time, studying with philosophers like Gianni Vattimo in the Faculty of Engineering, where he was running a set of courses connecting technology and philosophy, I got in contact with the idea of Gregory Bateson's and the ecology of mind, and now our understanding of ecology need the integration of what we call language and meta-language. So logical language as well as other language that cannot be described logically, such as visual language. So with all these ingredients together, it became relevant for us to study more and develop a way of working that would integrate ecological thinking and scientific knowledge from the beginning in the design method and in architecture in an organic manner, such in a way that you cannot pick apart what is the technology and what is the architecture. They become a living organism in itself. So we came to London, we studied architecture at the Architectural Association, and we started to implement some of the knowledge we had from the Faculty of Engineering in Turin and some of our interests. And the way we work now is really an intersection of this knowledge. We cannot really separate the technological part from the creative one.
How does ecoLogicStudio integrate biology, design, and technology in its work? Which of these leads the way?
It's like saying whether when I walk, my head, my shoulder, or my feet leads the way. Who knows? It depends. As I said, it's a question of integrating different knowledge, and depending from the project, there are nuances that leads the way. And of course, in terms of research, I operate within the framework of the Faculty of Architecture. But having said that, my interest is also, and our interest with Marco, is to understand discipline in a different manner, not from within the disciplinary domain that we inherited from modernity, for which discipline are architecture, biology, and science, but much more specific to a certain group. That my old knowledge of biology, computation, and architecture that are different from other groups, very specific at a specific scale. So in depth, but creating a body of knowledge that intersect what are knowledge from traditionally segregated domain.
What are some design experiments, scientific philosophies, and utopian theories that inspire the work done at ecoLogicStudio?
One of the main books that influenced the work of ecoLogicStudio is Steps on Ecology of Mind of Gregory Bateson. I would say that in terms of philosophical and design influence, the two main references are definitely Gregory Bateson and Frejotto. So how we see some of the experimentation done on Frejotto, an analog model, through the anthropological and cybernetic research of Gregory Bateson, and we reinterpret them in aesthetic term, and how aesthetic becomes a language to really tackle ecological issue. Going forward, there are many other philosophers that have influenced our work, Slavoj Žižek, Timothy Morton, and others. But I would say these two were the ones from which even the definition of the studio, ecoLogicStudio, come from.
You cite biodigestion as a measure to facilitate the growth of new cities from the waste of older ones. However, how does one account for non-biodegradable waste within this system?
So everything can be remetabolized, not everything can be biodigest. So remetabolization is a framework through which we look at multiple resources as well as waste in how they can be circulated, they can become part of our life again. And the question is looking at elements that might be considered negative as well, such as pollutant, CO2, NOx, UN2.5, PM10, not only as negative element, but as element that become a resource for other organisms or for other processes. So it's really important to look at circularity of life and embed this circularity in our daily life as urban dweller, so that we understand how the world that surrounds us can always become a resource. There is energy everywhere. We can produce energy from plants, from soil, by simply produce biological cells that produce energy. What we call waste can be a resource to create biomaterial, food, energy, and other resources. And this can be done in a beautiful way through design, in a way that enrich our life, increase our quality of life, and by increasing our quality of life, change us as human, make us more sensible and more capable to interact with the planet and take care of it. Because aesthetic is not simply a beautification, is a way of creating and establishing a communication with the planet, a communication that talks about care and transformation rather than emergency and fixing a disrupted problem. We might be facing a disruptive problem, but one of the solutions that we propose is to really go one step at a time and transform ourselves in the way we interact with many of the organisms that populate the planet.
Tell us a little about your previous books, The World Dubai Marine Life Incubator, Eco Machines V, 3.0 and Systemic Architecture, Operating Manual for the Self-Organizing City. What led you to work on biodesign in the age of artificial intelligence? Deep green?
So systemic architecture and deep green biodesign in the age of ecology are part of a line of project we will probably in publication. We will probably do others that we have developed with Routledge as a publisher, and that are part of the collection of our work and research. So systemic architecture was approximately 10 years ago and collected 10 years of work and research on eco-machine and systemic architecture. So really the beginning of the philosophy, the setting up of the material system. There is also a manual inside, really the setting up of our method. Deep green contain the latest 10 here, which are about the implementation, both in research than in practice, or how we call it, practice-based research, of this method and in projects that are effectively actualized, that we can monitor, that people can interact with, and from which we can scale up further. Eventually, there will be a sequence of this project and a further book that work as really a documentation of this journey of integration of biology, computation, and design. As I said, systemic architecture focusing mainly on the manual aspect and the set of material experimentation, while deep green biodesign in the age of artificial intelligence, proposing on one side a scientific paper on the photosynthetic technology, on the other a philosophical framework on how we approach intelligence, both biological and artificial, on our planet, and on a third level, showcasing project and prototype that are actualized, that are tested, that people can interact with, that really present this method that we have been setting up 10 years ago through systemic architecture. So this is their journey through these two books. On top of that, we have many publications, articles, and the book Marine Life Incubator is related to a specific project. We sometimes work on a specific journal or publication. In that case was a book. We are actually currently also writing another book that will be published next year on a specific project. And these are book and publication that are project specific. The Marine Life Incubator was looking at the World Dubai, the set of islands that were created in front of Dubai as a resource, but also transforming heavily the landscape, the bathymetric underwater landscape of the area. And the project was really looking at how we can keep transforming the area, but working in synergy with the local ecology rather than in a disrupted manner.
What is your expectation in terms of the reader's response to the book?
My expectation in many of the projects we do is always a conversation. So the two books, Synthetic Architecture and Deep Green, are both quite dense. That's why we are also now setting up other line of publication that focus more on a single project. So they include 10 years of research. So sometimes the feedback on the book come after 3 or 4 years when it's been really possible to engage with all the knowledge. But for us, the feedback is on multiple levels. On an academic level, is having a reference text as well as visual for the student to engage with this body of work and understand it on a deeper manner, on a technological, philosophical, as well as visual design level. At the same time, we would like to engage with a larger public, with both our client and partner, to discuss how the next 10 years could effectively be implemented. How do we scale from the photosynthetica prototypical project of the office, the playground, the home, algae garden, to the large scale of the city, to what Deep Green is envisioning through the large scale project. What are the next steps, and how we create a larger structure and larger set of collaboration that would allow this project to have scale their impact. I think from the previous book to this book, there has already been a huge impact in terms of the cultural transformation, in terms of the capability of a larger group of individuals, both in the public, then in practice, then in academia, to discuss ecological issues in a more sophisticated manner. The next step is understanding how this is implemented more systematically, both in our curriculum in academia, then in the workflow of design, in the implementation of architecture into the construction system.
How can issues such as the algal bloom be avoided while breeding microalgae?
The reason why we have algae blooming as a consequence of climate change is because algae are really resilient and feed on some of the byproduct of our urban sphere. But that's not a garden, that's not a communication, that's an explosion. One of the sentence I often use is, we are in time of climate change. But since Greek philosophy, and we know from Heraclito that nothing changed but change. Our planet change continuously. Change is a inherent quality of the planet. Without change, there is no life. But the problem with climate change is not change. It's the fact that change is disrupted, is out of control. It's not a conversation. It's a set of events we can't establish a dialogue with. So can we establish positive dynamic of change? Because the planet will keep changing and we will keep changing as part of life. But rather than changing in a disrupted manner, can we establish a new dialogue with the biosphere, between the biosphere and the urban sphere? And architecture can contribute to that by becoming more alive, more dynamic, more of an interface that allows this dialogue. So by establishing this dialogue, we will be able to establish positive dynamic of change. And it's not about controlling them, or it's about controlling, but in a different manner. When I have a dialogue, I don't control the other individual, being this a human or a robot. I don't control the other individual. I establish a dialogue with the other individual. And so we don't need to control the planet. Actually, we can't. But we need to establish a dialogue with the planet. It's a different mind frame. We come still from conceptual and cultural framework that allow us to think that we might be able to control city, control energy, control food, but we can't control geometrically. We can't control all the parameters, but we can establish a dialogue. We can establish a conversation, which is much more similar to what we do when we garden. That's why I go back to the initial part of the sentence. I was putting gardening and conversation in the same sentence, because gardening, as Gilles Deleuze discussed beautifully in some of his book, is about choreographies. You don't fix the geometry of a flower, you interact through nutrient, water, and sun, and every day the gardener knows something more about the flower. So interact with the garden, cannot fully control the garden, because there are other law, other system, other inner logic that control the garden. But you can establish a dialogue with the garden. It's a form of communication, a form of design that is different from designing a geometrical structure. Designing a garden is a lot about interaction, communication, and cybernetic loop. And that's where we need to shift. More and more design needs to be similar to gardening and conversation. In that way, we can establish positive dynamic. We can understand, we can exert a certain degree of control, which is the control you exert when you create a communication. You establish a kinship. When you have a friend, you have a kin, you have a certain degree of control, which is not control, but is a certain degree of influence as your friend has got on you. So that's the type of relationship and type of, if we want to call it control, I don't like to call it control, but if we can establish. But it's not about traditional control, it's about conversation and deeper understanding of the process. The more we understand, the more we care, also through pleasure, I underline, is not all a punishment, also through pleasure and rituals and our capability to use all our senses to read the planet, we can cultivate it and establish and try to swing the tendency from the current one that is, I acknowledge, disrupted to a positive one.
In the book, you mention that the reasoning for certain observations and critiques of ecoLogicStudio's practice and intent is anchored in a modernist dualism of form versus function and aesthetic versus ethic. What is the genesis of this concept? Is it born out of convenience, or are there deeper underlying issues determining this dissonance?
Well, in the current culture, we have a segregation that exists between what we consider ethical and we consider aesthetical. We often don't see the two as interconnected. In terms of modern architecture was completely socially, politically, ecologically contextualized in the period in which modern architecture was conceived. And in that sense, was proposing an aesthetic that was based on the white surface, on cleaning, on bacteria were dangerous in that sense, were outside of the paradigm of architecture. This was an attempt to, let's say, reframe some of the villages we inherited from the medieval time, from history, that had huge issue in terms of well-being and health for the way they were structured, but they had huge benefit in terms of relational system. That's why in terms of urban design, also modern architecture was proposing the zoning, was proposing to segregate the living quarter from production and waste. The machines that were part of the first industrial revolution were extremely in their exhaust. It wouldn't be possible at the time to create a more synergetic relationship between production, waste, and living quarter. It would have been extremely dangerous. So, rightly so, at that time, modern architecture proposed a paradigm of segregation, whereas the living quarter is segregated from production, is segregated from waste disposal. But by doing so, it's also segregated our consciousness, the consciousness of the urban dweller, from witnesses this process and understanding them in a deepened manner. In a pre-industrial society, pre-modern architecture, the architecture of the rural village, there was a synergetic relationship between waste, recycling, recirculating resources. Aboriginal groups had an understanding on how recirculate resources because they were in daily contact with them. They didn't need to read in a book how to recycle. They were able to do it because they could see it with their eyes, with their body. They could sense it with all their senses. Modern architecture, to establish a next step of civilization, has proposed a model whereas the living quarter is segregated from all the production, has been, let's say, productive to a specific social ecological context, but is now outdated. Now we have technology that are not burning the coal. They are soft, bubbly. They are nature-based technology we could interact with in a daily basis. It's actually beneficial for us because they could produce oxygen for us, remetabolize some of our pollutants. So they can be integrated again in architecture. In this way, not only remetabolizing resources and producing oxygen for us, but also reconnecting what the first industrial revolution and modern architecture has broken, our relationship with flow of production and transformation in the city. This is a very important link that we need to recover in the fourth industrial revolution. This communication with production and transformation is essential for us to engineer a new society, design a carbon neutral civilization. I'm unveiling part of the title of the next book here. So how do we design a new civilization that engage with this process from the bottom up?
How can the cybernetic approach for reframing aesthetics, as suggested by Slavoj Zizek and Gregory Bateson, and referenced in the book, be implemented on a larger scale practically?
It seems a little bit of an oxymoron to say, how do you apply philosophy practically? But apologies for the joke. But aside from the oxymoron, let's say what we borrow from the philosophy of Timothy Morton and Slavoj Zizek is exactly this interest in reestablishing a conversation with processes that have been segregated from us. This is exactly the question of how we reconnect aesthetic and ecology. In natural system, the aesthetic appearance is also a way to engage the ecological health of the system. The morphological development is a morphogenetic one, embed the process of transformation. And in relationship to the philosopher that you mentioned, for example, Zizek talked about the disavowal. So how we can read on a newspaper about the disruption of climate change. But essentially, when as urban dweller we go out, he described like we hear bird singing, we see flower and tidy city, and we struggle to perceive the extent of this transformation. So in one of these book, but also in a video that he has realized, he shoots the video and make the conversation from a waste recycling center in London and discuss how real ecology consider this beautiful and try to understand how, and for us, this means we try to understand how this is beautiful. How can we interact with waste on a daily manner? So it's important that we reconnect with the cycle. We understand that they are a richness. We design them in a different manner so that we can effectively interact with it. So we don't understand them as beautiful in a dystopic manner, but we really deconstruct waste so that become part of our daily life in a beautiful way. Similar, we borrow I'm talking about borrowing because I like to think that there are elements of the philosophy that correlate with our work, but there might be other elements that don't. So you don't take all philosophy and transform it in your work, you borrow some aspect. And from Timothy Morton, I would say that the concept of dark ecology is one of the concepts that we have correlated with the most, how ecology is not simply green ecology in the term that we cannot renaturalize a forest, regreen city, as if we could bring back a slider of a temporally perturbed biosphere. We need to engage with the dark side of ecology that might trigger fear to us for the way it is framed at the moment. We need to engage with bacteria, with traditional waste, and understand how this is a richness, how there is beauty there that can be recirculated, transformed, and become part of our daily life. We need to accept that in ecological terms, some cycles have been disrupted, but can come back as part of a circularity. There will always be a certain degree of disruption and catastrophe. But how do we deal with this from the within? By accepting the disruption and working day by day to transform it and understanding better. It's a very important point. Not seeing the catastrophe from the outside and try to fix it in an emergency. Sometimes some fixing is required, but essentially as a philosophical position, as a design position, we need to work step by step on the day by day to transform the planet again and transform ourselves. I would underline. We cannot transform the planet if we don't transform ourselves or reconnect to sensibility we might have had in the pre-industrial society and lost a little bit.
What are your thoughts on the rights of nature? Can its proper implementation make our cities more sustainable? What are some aspects that can be exploited through its practice?
Well, this is an aspect that maybe we should engage with legal system, but there is a relevance in understanding how non-human agency acquire a political agency effectively. How do we see organism not simply as element to exploit, but element we interact with, as I said before. We often discuss how we could give a biocitizen to bacteria, fungi, and other form of intelligence, both biological and artificial. And this is really how we transform our cultural paradigm from using resources to putting ourselves on the same plane of other organisms that populate the planet and engage with with these organisms. It's not a question of conserving ecological system or conservation, because I understand the paradigm of conservation, and again, it's useful on certain occasions, but ecology, again, change all the time. Often when you try to preserve an ecology, you might harm it as well, because preservation is a concept that doesn't work with the dynamic of ecology. But understanding that ecological system have a position in the planet, an agency on the planet even, it's a relevant conceptual and I would say political step.
How can biomanufacturing technology tend to the energy needs of entire cities? How can it replace the need for oil and gas?
Well, I'm not in general about replacing, but I'm for understanding. I'll explain what I mean with that in a second. It's really important that we understand when to interact with one resource and when to interact with the other. At the moment, there will need to be some degree of replacing, yes. On that we agree, because we are abusing on one or few type of resources. For me, the question is, how do we create a variety? There might be punctual occasion in which petrol-based resources are still useful or necessary. In the moment petrol-based plastic came about, or in certain occasion, has been used in ecological terms. It was used, for example, in the 70s to substitute in the design of what at the time was a TV, rare resources were substituted with petrol-based plastic. In that case, we'll make it more durable, we'll make it more sustainable. But at the moment, it's an ubiquitous material. It's used for a huge amount of purpose. This is extremely problematic. Nothing can be used for everything and become ubiquitous. So the short answer is yes, we can move from petrol-based resources to nature-based solution. The long question is how, once we have started to do that, we try to understand how we use specific resources with different temporality at a different time. I make an example that also comes from one of the Zizek discourse, so is borrowed from there. Petrol is in reality biological, or mineral. It comes from trees. Just the cell is locked with so much energy that requires a lot of energy to unlock it. So the question is, and require a lot of years to produce it. So there are different degrees of how we consider something biological. But so on the short term, I agree with you. We can and we should make a movement to nature-based solution. On the long term, we should acquire a deeper understanding of the resources that surround us, how long they take to be produced, how long it takes for a process to come about, which process I can interact with for a certain purpose, and which process I can interact with for another purpose. This is for me the real ecology, an ecology of diversity, of different temporality. Not everything needs to be biodegradable in one day. Maybe some element needs to biodegrade in 1 hour, 1 minute, 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, 10 years. It depends. It's really a question of understanding in a deeper manner and creating a much more sophisticated relationship with the planet, with ecology, with the processes.
What's next for ecoLogicStudio?
Well, in terms of the research, we would like to expand on other form of biological intelligence. We have a lot of research on slime mold, as you know, on mycelium, and I think in terms of research, it's really about starting to implement also other nature-based solutions that are now ready to implement in project. In terms of the photosynthetic line, is a question of how we make this movement that we mentioned before, from the single prototypical element, the playground, the household, the office space, to the museum, to the collective, the city, the collective of photosynthetic element, the microbiome of the city. How do we redesign the microbiome of the city? As you know, there are a lot of discussion also about urban forests, but to create an urban forest, you need to work on the microbiome. And this is the first step we need to do. And to do that, we need to understand how we culturally and technologically expand the integration of microorganisms in the planet that we know already, but needs to be implemented in the construction system, which is the step we are approaching at the moment. And then integrate eventually also other organisms, other micro-landscape that allow really the transformation of the built environment in a more soft, wet, alive one that is able to be receptive of light, biophilic of life.